Welcome to today's Veterans Day ceremony for the City of Laguna Niguel. I'm Mayor Pro Tem Elaine Genoway, and I'll be your guide through the program. We are absolutely delighted that you're here today. We will begin with the presentation of the flags by Boy Scout Troop 772, followed by the national anthem sung by Katie Schaefer, and a moment of silence by Dennis Mulvaney, Vice Commander of American Legion Post 281 and Laguna Niguel Military Support Committee member. Boys?
Color guard attention. Audience attention, please. Color guard mark. If you're not in uniform, please place your right hand over your heart. Audience, please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge
allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Two. Color guard group. Color guard dismissed. Audience at ease.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight for the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets regular, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave for the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, for whom the bell tolls, please stand for a moment of silence to honor those who gave their lives to protect our freedom. Thank you. You may be seated.
Hey, thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Katie. That was wonderful. So I'd like to introduce to you some of our distinguished guests who are here today. We have from Malta Niguel Water District, Director Scott Colton and Director Richard Fiore. Thank you for being here, gentlemen. And also from our American Legion Post, Laguna Niguel 281, the founding commander, Bill Lieber, and the current commander, John Pointer. And Laguna Niguel City Councilman John Mark Jennings is here with us today. And welcoming us to today's program is Mayor Fred Minigar. Fred, if you would please come up here.
Thank you very much, Mayor Pro Tem Elaine Genoway. Good morning, honorable guests, veterans, ladies and gentlemen. Isn't it another beautiful day in this great city of ours? I'm standing here talking about our flag and our freedoms, proclaiming that without our patriots, the Constitution would not be worth the paper it is written on, that our flag might not be our flag and flying like it is today, and to whom do we owe? Our freedom of religion, we do not owe it to the preacher man, but to the patriot. Our freedom of the press, we do not owe it to the reporter, but to the patriot. Our freedom of speech, we do not owe it to the poet, but to the patriot. Our right to vote or safe govern, we do not owe it to the politician, but to the many, many patriots that have sacrificed for God, our country, and our American way of life. Laguna Niguel sons and daughters, you have answered the call. We've all had choices, options, and opportunities. While I do not know the reason that you've taken that path, you've traveled that path that led you to become a member of our armed forces, I want to thank you for your services from the bottom of my heart. I want to thank your families for their sacrifices. Again, this community thanks you. In closing, we follow the footprints of others, and we are always only a generation away from being greater or just a memory. So I salute our current veterans and our future veterans. Thank you for preserving our freedoms and making us greater. May God continue to watch over all of us. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you, Mayor Minigar. And now, in what has become a tradition in Laguna Niguel, Boy Scout Troop 772 will present us with the history of Veterans Day.
Veterans Day is a U.S. legal holiday dedicated to American veterans of all wars. 99 years ago, in 1918, on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month, an armistice, or temporary end of fighting, was declared between the Allied nations and Germany in World War I, which at the time was called the Great War.
The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, marking the end, was signed on June 28, 1919, marking the official end of World War I. Still, the armistice date of November 11, 1918 is remembered as a date that marked the end of the conflict because that's when the bloodshed actually stopped.
1 year later, in November 1919, U.S. President Woodrow Wilson proclaimed November 11th as the first commemoration of Armistice Day. The day's observations included parades and public gatherings, as well as a brief pause in business and school activities at 11 a.m.
On November 11th, 1921, an unidentified American soldier killed in the war was buried at Arlington National Cemetery near Washington, D.C. On the same day that the previous year, the unidentified soldier were laid to rest at Westminster Abbey in London and at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris.
On June 4th, 1926, Congress passed a resolution that a reoccurring anniversary of November 11th, 1918 should be commemorated with Thanksgiving, prayer, exercises designed to perpetuate the peace through good will and mutual understanding between nations, and that the President should issue a national proclamation calling for the observance of Armistice Day.
By that time, 27 state legislators had made November 11th a legal holiday. An act approval May 13th, 1938 made November 11th a legal federal holiday dedicated to the cause of world peace and to be hereafter celebrated as Armistice Day.
American effort during World War II saw the greatest mobilization of the U.S. Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force in the nation's history. More than 16 million people and nearly 6 million more served in the Korean War.
In 1954, after lobbying efforts by veteran service organizations, the 83rd U.S. Congress amended the 1938 Act that had made Armistice Day a holiday, striking the word armistice in favor of veterans. President Dwight D. Eisenhower signed the legislation on June 1st, 1954. From then on, November 11th became a day to honor American veterans of all wars.
A century ago today, American forces were still battling against vast numbers of the enemy in the First World War. Alive with us today are veterans of the Second World War, Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, the Gulf Wars, and the War on Terror.
In Laguna Niguel, we observe Veterans Day as a tribute to our citizens that have stepped up to defend our nation and its way of life by serving in the armed forces of the United States of America. Please help us as the Boy Scouts to carry forth this tradition and to salute them today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Troop 772. Those are our future leaders. Okay, there are stories that must be shared and lessons learned by all of us and then passed on to the next generation so that our community and our country can continue its destiny of freedom. We are fortunate to have members of the Freedom Committee of Orange County here with us today to share their stories. Our first speaker will be First Lieutenant David K. Hayward of the United States Army Air Force. Dave Hayward earned his wings and commissioned in the United States Army Air Force in 1942. He flew 53 combat missions as a pilot of a B-25 medium bomber in the 22nd Bomb Squadron in the China-Burma-India Theater of World War II, for which he was awarded the Air Medal and Distinguished Flying Cross. David has returned to China 7 times with veterans groups and has written 2 books on his wartime experience. He is currently active in the Freedom Club of Orange County. Their purpose is to send veterans to speak to students in their history classes as part of a living history program. Please welcome David Hayward.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you, Mr. Mayor and Madam Mayor Pro Tem. It's very nice of you to invited us here today. And I want to thank distinguished people for making the effort to come out and be a part of the gathering. All right. I enlisted, as you can see, here in February 1942 in Los Angeles. That was 2 months after the war started. And I might say that when that war started, it appeared to us that every able-bodied male was going to have to serve one way or another, and our choice was whether to enlist in something that might be interesting to do or to wait and be drafted and end up wherever they sent us. And I might ask, how many of you people either wanted to learn how to fly an airplane or have actually done it? That's what I thought, quite a number. Well, that's the way I was. I'd seen every movie that Hollywood produced that had to do with airplanes, and there was always a good guy and a bad guy and a beautiful girl, and you can guess that something bad happened to the bad guy, but the good guy ended up with a beautiful girl. So my favorite thing was my 1934 Ford V8, and there it was, and there I am. Okay. My first assignment was at what was then the Santa Ana Army Air Base, and it's located in where Costa Mesa is today. And they didn't have much for us to do at the time because I think I was the second class to go in there. And they taught us how to march, as you could see, hour after hour. And for some reason, the weather decided to play tricks on us that month. And rained nearly every day. There was no pavement, just adobe mud, and so there we were. And you'll see that there's a tall pole there with a, okay, let's go back here one. A tall pole there with a loudspeaker that was playing march music all the time. And so we marched to that and got all fired up with this great John Philip Sousa march music. Okay, then it was off to flying school at Tulare up near Bakersfield, and there's nothing quite like the goggles and this white scarf and the leather jacket to make us really feel pretty important. And for a shy, introverted kid of 19 years old, all of a sudden to be thrown into that environment, well, believe me, it was really something. Okay, then they taught us to fly that Stearman PT-17. It was a lot of fun to fly. We did loop-the-loops and barrel rolls and live dives and climbs, and once in a while the instructor would shut off the throttle and say, forced landing. So we had to figure out what to do. We'd look out the side of the airplane and see if we could find a plowed field that we could pretend to land in. Of course, the instructor always run the throttle back forward again before we landed on the plowed field, but we had to do that over and over and over again. I thought of that many times when, the pilot had to land in the Hudson River not too long ago. That's something he was trained to do from the very earliest days, to look for a place to put the airplane down if he had to. Okay, the final graduation day came, and they gave us a set of wings and second lieutenant's bars to wear. And again, for a shy 19-year-old kid, that was a pretty big moment in my life. Our next training was in the B-25 Mitchell bomber. That's the same kind of airplane that Jimmy Doolittle and his people flew off the deck of a Carrier Hornet in April 1942 against the Japanese islands. Okay, I just want to say a word about this, that to give you an idea of where I served: India, Burma, and China. A little bit of history that the Japanese occupied China in 1937. That was 4 years before we got into the war. and they'd closed off the ports so that China had two main problems. One, that they couldn't get supplies anymore, and secondly, that the Japanese were mercilessly bombing the Chinese civilians that had moved into the western part of China. Now, in those days, Japan was not like it is today. Today, Japan's a very friendly country, a very good friend, and we support them. But in those days, it was Imperial Japan, and they had some ideas that were contrary to those of the people that lived in China and Burma, and even India to some degree. Okay, the request that China made of President Franklin Roosevelt was two things. Could you send some fighter planes over here to shoot down those bombers that are bombing our civilians in the western part of China? And so the U.S. did. They asked some people primarily in the Navy to resign their commission, become civilians again, and man some P-40 fighter planes and come over and shoot down those Imperial Japanese fighter planes. So they did that, and their first mission was 18 days after Pearl Harbor. I believe that was the first U.S. military action against the Japanese in World War II, the Flying Tigers. And they shot down a formation of Japanese bombers, and that was something that the Chinese appreciated very much. The second thing that Franklin Roosevelt, our president, arranged was set up a supply route from northeast India down into southwest China. We call it the Flying the Hump, flown over a branch of the Himalaya Mountains into China. And that started, as you can see here, in June 1942. And here's a little close-up of the hump route from northeast India to southwest China. Well, the Japanese were playing a game of gotcha with us, and we were playing a game of gotcha with them. The Japanese moved into Burma, occupied it. This is the Brahmaputra River. There's a railroad that runs along the river. The Japanese set up a fighter base at this city in northern Burma called Myitkyina. And they proceeded to shoot down our cargo planes that were flying the hump. A total of 6 cargo planes we know of were shot down, as well as another 6 by a Chinese airline. So they were saying, okay, gotcha now. But it was our turn to say gotcha when, oh, this is the type of fighter plane the Japanese had. It's called an Oscar, and that's what was waiting to greet us. So by saying gotcha, we sent the 10th Air Force into India, which is comprised of B-25s of the 22nd Bomber Squadron. That was my squadron, as well as B-24s, heavy bombers, and P-40 fighter planes. And we were sent to a place called Chakulia, India, which is 100 miles west of Calcutta. And our mission was to fly these medium bombers into central Burma, fairly close to the Mandalay area, and to try to knock out every bridge, every locomotive, every airfield that the enemy was using, every barge on the river, anything that the enemy was using to move fuel and ordnance from the port of Rangoon into northern Burma, where they had an airfield. And I've thought many times that, for me, I feel fortunate that I was not sent to bomb population areas, but rather to strictly confine our activities to supply lines that the enemy was using. Okay. We started out by doing this kind of work, obviously attacking a bridge. Obviously, if the enemy could not get across a river, well, it was not likely to be moving much in the way of fuel and ammunition up to where their fighter planes were located. I have this picture in for two reasons. We had a pilot who was a great artist, and he did a lot of artwork like this. And we also realized that we had to maintain a sense of humor, or we were all going to go bonkers on the job. So it shows a pilot here shaking his arms at those naughty Japanese for having the audacity to shoot at us. Well, that was kind of the attitude a lot of us kept. It's probably a good thing we did. And the second thing I wanted to say was that although I went overseas as a pilot of a crew of 5 people, I was asked to sit in the right seat, the co-pilot seat, for the first several missions, so that I could get used to the idea of being shot at and the bad weather and the terrible mountains that we had to contend with. So I was initially sitting in the co-pilot seat. Okay, and this is really the main thrust I wanted to give to you today, that there was a call for volunteers. Well, when that call comes out, several things go through your mind. One of them is like this guy. Again, these are done by this pilot who's a great artist in our squadron. That volunteer, what do you mean? You must be crazy. And here's a guy that did volunteer to ride a bomb down to and see that it got to the ground. And so what should happen, but I was flying co-pilot, as I said, and my pilot volunteered to do the job. So he came around to me and asked me did I want to go along with him, and gosh, I thought for a minute that life is pretty boring around here. In 1 year, I flew 53 combat missions, so that's 1 a week on the average. That means that you have an awful lot of time on your hands with nothing to do except complain and sleep and play cards. That's about all we did. So life is boring, and that would be an adventure. And 19 years of age, well, you know how those people think. They figure nothing bad will ever happen to them, and here's an opportunity to really do something interesting. So off we went, 1 airplane, with a crew of 5, destination Dinjan in the state of Assam, India. I went to the internet to pick up this picture because I wanted to give you an idea of just what the state of Assam looks like. It's known for its tea plantations, and this is the sort of thing you see. Again, I just picked this up recently on the internet. I also looked on the internet to see if I could find a picture that is like the bungalow that we lived in. Oh, this series of volunteer missions lasted over 5 days. So for 5 days, we lived in that bungalow in the tea plantation. And I do remember the stilts, and I do remember that it was 2-story, and that the second story was entirely screened all around, and that it was pretty nice living there. Okay, the first of these missions that we flew on April 30th, 1943, we left from India. This is the Brahmaputra River in India, northeast India. We left from this area. We flew 200 miles into Burma. This is the town of Myitkyina that I talked about. There's a Irrawaddy River that leads into it and a railroad that parallels the river, 75 miles from Myitkyina. It was also unusual that this is the only time that during my service in that area that they gave us fighter escort, and these are P-40s. And I took that picture myself out the window of our B-25. This is another thing that our artist did. He's showing enemy fighters taking off at a base similar to Michinaw, and I was thinking all the way to the target, that wondering if this was happening right then and that soon we'd be facing these fighter planes. Okay, the first mission, there's good records kept of what we were doing over there, and they're available at Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama. And so from that material, I was able to pick up a lot of reports. And that particular mission, it tells how our one single B-25 and 4 P-40s attacked this town of Monyen with this type of ordnance, and that the bombs fell in the northwest section of town, causing many explosions. No anti-aircraft or activity was noted. And this is the sort of thing that our artist friend drew to indicate bombs falling on warehouses, enemy warehouses, and that sort of thing. Okay, that mission we made okay. So the next day we flew another single plane mission again, one B-25, 4 P-40s, again, hoping 60 miles from Michinaw. This is the ordnance we had. 90% of the bombs hit in the target area, starting 12 fires, several with large columns of black smoke. And then this shows that some anti-aircraft fire was encountered and no further problems encountered. So this, again, the artist's idea of what it looks like when you drop bombs on enemy holdings of warehouses and that sort of thing. Okay, we returned safely to Dinjan on that second mission, had lunch. This is obviously an exaggeration. That normally doesn't happen in wartime, but these, we did have India nationals, bearers, they called them, waiting on us, and that was nice. So the third mission that afternoon, we got back in our airplane again, and we did it again. One B-25, 2 P-40s on a search and destroy mission along the railroad line leading to Michinaw. Now, this picture was not of that particular raid, but it's one I pulled out of my collection to give an idea of approximately what it was like. Here's a barge on the Irrawaddy River, and we were certainly interested in destroying anything like that the enemy could use to move ordnance and fuel up to their airfield. Okay, on this fourth mission, this is a very, very strange one. A colonel came along and saw our airplane parked out there in the airfield, and he said he'd like to borrow it and see if he can find an enemy homing station up in the Himalaya Mountains. And he asked our pilot, do you want to go? And he said no. First of all, he said, would like to borrow your airplane. Well, you say, yes, sir, Colonel. So he liked it. It had 2 engines, and it had a radio compass, and that's what he needed. So the pilot said, no, I don't want to go. He asked me, do you want to be my co-pilot? Well, what do you do in a case like that? Yes, sir. It sounds like a new adventure to me. So here we go again, the Brahmaputra River in India. We were stationed here, and we went up into the Brahmaputra River into India. This is Tibet. Here's the border between Tibet and India. Over here is Burma. So we decided to fly up into the mountains there and see if we could find this so-called enemy homing station. Now, a homing station is designed to, in this case, to throw our cargo planes into thinking that they were closer to their home base than they actually were, and that they would let down too soon, namely over the mountains. And while we're almost always flying in clouds, we wouldn't know there were mountains there, and the plane would crash. So that's why it was necessary to see if there was a homing station up there. And this, again, is an exaggeration. I had to show the colonel how to do certain things, like how to engage the superchargers at 10,000 feet, which gave more power to the engines. We normally, co-pilots do not go around like this with a coffee cup in their hand, but I thought you might get a kick out of it. Okay, we were only 30 miles from the Tibetan border. We could climb no higher. Normally the B-25 has a service ceiling of, let's say, 25,000 feet. And we were flying at 20,000. And again, I took that picture myself. And I tell people that I grew up in Pasadena, and I went to Pasadena Junior College. And my favorite course there was geology. And I really thought our professor there did a great job of explaining the U-shaped valleys, the hanging tributaries, the meandering river in the valley below. And so here I was actually seeing what he was telling me about. Of course, we all know about Yosemite, but this is even larger than Yosemite. And one more picture. I took that one too. So at 20,000 feet, you can look out the window and see that's just about the same altitude as the tops of those mountains. This would be known as the Himalayan Plateau. We're 100 miles into the Himalaya Mountains. And you can't see it from here, but Mount Everest would be in the distance over here. What did we accomplish? Well, I thought quite a while whether I should even show this, but it said the 10 people aboard observed spectacular scenery that they'd probably never see again in their life. 8 people shared 4 oxygen outlets. They all had headaches that night. We never found, never even searched for an enemy homing beacon. The flight might have been, it certainly was, a boondoggle planned by the colonel just to show his friends some scenery that they would never see again in their life. I felt a little guilty about showing this because while we were doing that, Americans had gas rationing going on and were limited very much to what they could buy. There is no official record made of that flight, only my own record on that. Okay, so then we got back to business the following day, May 3rd, and did it again down into the Michina area. 1 B-25, 3 P-40s. As top cover, departed from Dinjan for armed reconnaissance. And again, my artist friend did this when showing a Japanese fighter plane attacking a B-25 such as ours. Would our luck hold out again, or would the enemy attack this time? We didn't know. Okay, the 5th mission, the official report was that they bombed rolling stock at Nam Thi, Burma, 23 miles from Michina. Here we through this route. Here's Michina. There's Nam Thi, very close to it. The official report continued. It showed what bombs we dropped. We had 3 direct hits, destroying 6 railroad cars with 5 near misses. Now you might think, well, that's pretty trivial, but again, it was just a single bomber, and there was a reason for that. A single bomber could more easily slip out of the clouds and catch them by surprise. And the targets were not big enough to warrant a full formation of, say, 9 airplanes. Okay, afterward, the formation made reconnaissance over Michina. They observed 2 sunken river steamers. This is not what we did. We didn't drop any bombs on it, but I pulled this out of my file because it shows what someone else had done. And intelligence reported that roads and bridges appear to be in good condition, well-traveled, and would be good targets. So my artist friend, mission accomplished. We avoided the enemy fighter planes, and I would return to my regular job of stopping enemy air attacks on our cargo planes by concentrating in the central Burma area around Mandalay. Afterward, it was found that one airplane had gone out, and they heard someone using Morse code that had our call signals, come back, come back. Obviously, the Japanese were trying to trick this man into aborting a mission, but he didn't do it. He went on ahead. And then actually, we did find later on an enemy homing beacon, but it was not in the Himalaya Mountains. It was near the town of Sumprabum, Burma, about 80 miles north of Myitkyina, which makes more sense. And I put this picture in, we had a reunion in Rapid City in 1992. This man, Pat Ham, was the pilot of the plane that I was co-pilot on that did all those, and this is me at the time. This is the illustrator, and thank you for listening. And do I hear any questions from the audience? Does this ring a bell or bring back any? I think I see a hand up. Oh, yes.
The Japanese fighters, were they Zeros at the time you were in?
No, the Zeros were generally the Navy planes. There were other names for these Japanese Army planes called, this was an Oscar, there was a Frank, there's a Betty bomber, although the Betty bomber was Navy. But we've been cautioned not to call these Zeros because they're Japanese Army planes. Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Good question. How long did it take you to learn how to pronounce all those names?
How long did it take me to do what?
Learn how to pronounce those names.
A long time. That word Myitkyina, see, I have to be careful because I'm not the only veteran that comes up places like this and makes speeches. Quite often there'll be somebody who is also there, and if I say the least thing wrong, they're going to catch it right now. So, yeah. And the other question? Yeah. How many missions did you have to fly before you were rotated back home? 53. The rule was 50, but they didn't have the policy set up until I had done 53. In fact, my last mission was to a place called Touraine, French Indochina. It is now known as Da Nang, Vietnam. And years later, the Americans moved in and, as you know, had the Vietnam War going, and they renamed those cities. And so again, my last mission, I have another slideshow that shows some of the work we did there by coming in at low level on Da Nang while it was held by the Japanese. Yes?
You said you had written 2 books. Are they available to read?
Yes, I did. I have a very few copies that are on a table out in front. One's called A Young Man in the Wild Blue Yonder, taken from the words of our Air Force song. And the other, and that's kind of my story, the other is a collection of short stories written by other veterans in my squadron that very well illustrated by this same John Johns that did this sort of thing. Any others? And then sooner or later I'm going to be told to turn the mic over to Bob. Anything, or is this the time for me to quit?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And he will be here afterwards while we're having refreshments, so please be sure to speak with him and ask any more questions that you have. Our second speaker today is Captain Robert Olds, United States Navy retired. He served 31 years in the Navy during the Cold War in Vietnam, and today he will provide us with the school program he regularly presents to students as part of the Freedom Committee of Orange County's Living History program. Please welcome Captain Olds.
Thank you all for inviting us, particularly the city officials and all for having us here. It's a pretty good-sized audience, and I'm very happy to be here, and let's see what's going to show up here in a minute. The school programs we do, there's a whole bunch of we veterans that go to the schools, middle school up through college, and give a presentation of our living history. You've seen that in the program. That's what standard thing puts out by Freedom Committee. Let you know when we served, where we served, I served from July 1953 to July 1984, 31-year career. That's Cold War and Vietnam. We're supposed to, the schools want us to tell people a little bit about where did we come from. Well, that's me at age 2. We're in Anaheim. My folks had an orange grove. And if you notice the toys, they're very much mechanically oriented. So either my folks wanted me to have a mechanical aptitude, or I was already showing one. Either case, it worked, as you'll see. The other thing about the toys, they're pretty much high quality. And that was going to be the last high quality toys because the Great Depression had hit. And that was a time in our nation where there was great poverty. People were losing their homes and groves. My folks lost the home in a grove. Back to the bank. We bounced around for a couple of years as my father went wherever he could to get a job. We ended up finally settling in Arcadia up in the San Gabriel Valley. And even though money was tight, we did have a backyard pool. We dug that ourselves. Arcadia was very rural at that time. I'm giving my buddies a ride in a neighbor's horse and buggy and horse and wagon. And there's a 5-story office building on that site today. Yes, I was mechanically oriented. I built things. This is a roller coaster. It has a cart on it. It's got skate wheels. It goes down this track. It went down, took a jump, made a turn, and came to a stop. It was a real thrilling ride. And yes, my cousin did survive. He went on to be a Navy pilot also. I thought I had a lot of badges there, guy, but you got me beat. But for the Scouts, and I point this out to the students, I was in Scouts from age 9 to 17, and the Scouts, and getting all these merit badges, achieving Eagle Scout, leadership positions, gave me things that helped me throughout my life, and particularly my Navy career. So for the Scouts here, both boys and girls, listen to your leaders. They're guiding you on things that will help you for the rest of your life. My first car was a 9-year-old Studebaker. I kept that car for another 5 years, overhauled the engine a couple of times, changed the suspension, rebuilt the brakes. That's how we kept them running. Ran track in high school, junior college, quarter mile, half mile, and that's me. The guy on my right went on to be a Marine Corps pilot. It was my schools. I ended up Cal Poly, San Luis Obispo, a graduate degree in mechanical engineering. After about 10 years in the Navy's also very interested in education, sent me to postgraduate school and received a master's degree. This is a very important day for me. While I was in college, I had joined the Naval Reserve because the draft was very real. We all knew we were going to get service someplace. Korean War was on, so I joined the Naval Reserve, learned about a Reserve Officer Candidate program, graduated from college, completed the program, and I've now been commissioned to ensign in the United States Navy. I now have a paying job. I have a new car, and I'm going to drive that car across country to Pensacola, Florida for flight training. That's the airplane we learned to fly in, student pilot in the front, instructor in the back. We did, just like Dave talked about, loops and fly wherever you wanted to fly sometimes, and instruments. We also landed on an aircraft carrier, a hallmark of a Navy pilot. I was still interested in big mechanical things, so I opted for multi-engine flight training. This was our trainer at that time, 2 pilots, 2 engines. And after 18 months in flight training, went to my first operational squadron, which was flying P-2V Neptunes. That's up in Alaska, because we were up close to where the Russians' submarine bases were, and that was our mission I'll talk a little bit more about later. There was a saying in the 1950s, join the Navy and see the world. I did that. All those little red dots are places I have been. I have been to 26 different countries. I have flown over every ocean up there, flown over or sailed upon every ocean up there except the Indian Ocean and Antarctica. I've done a lot up in the Arctic, in both North and South Pacific, North and South Atlantic, and you rattle them off. That was my first flight crew, aircraft commander, co-pilot. I'm the 3rd pilot now. I'm a new guy. fourth pilot even newer than me, and I was getting ready because I was moving pretty well in my training. I was going to take over as co-pilot. We wore something called a Mark IV exposure suit, a miserable thing to wear. It was a quilted lining, a rubberized suit, and it gripped your neck so tight you could hardly talk. And we would be in that for a 10-hour mission, and we'd get into it an hour before. Very uncomfortable thing, but it had one purpose. We were flying over very, very cold water in the Arctic or in the Bering Sea. It was designed to keep us alive if we had to get out of that airplane. If we crash landed in the water, it would keep us alive long enough to get into the raft. Miserable thing to wear. Pilots, we also had on life jackets, parachute harnesses, all these survival gear. And I've been asked many times, how come the rest of the crew didn't have all that survival gear? Simply because they hadn't put it on yet when the photographer arrived. We all wore the same thing. Pictures in flight. I don't have a whole lot in my collection because two things. One, if you were busy doing your job, you didn't have time to take the picture. And the other part was the weather was so lousy, there was nothing to take a picture of other than weather. And that was typical up in the Aleutians. This was an approach to Kodiak, Alaska. Happens to be a summer day, a nice day. In the typical winter days up there, we would not even have seen the runway yet before we landed on it. Very tough weather. And something Aleutians runways all seem to have, and that's a mountain at the end of them. You really don't want a mountain at the end of your runway because you have to get that airplane on the ground and stopped. This moved on down the Aleutians. That's Great Sitkan Volcano. It's about 5,700 feet high. And it's typical weather. Some high stuff up here, kind of clear in the middle, but starting here at about 4,500 feet, right on down to the ocean surface was where the bad weather was. The rain, the snow, the sleet, everything that, and that's where we flew because we had to see what the Soviet ships or submarines were. We had to see them and take pictures of them. So we flew in a lot of cruddy weather. That's the base at Adak. It's got a nice long runway here. It's got a mountain at the end of it. Shorter runway here. It's got a mountain you had to fly around to land on it. So the terrain and the weather were always our enemy. They were always, we learned to be very good all-weather pilots. That's a summer view of Adak. If you'll notice, there's no trees, there's no bushes. It's a volcanic island. There's nothing there but tundra. The whole island looks like that. But sailors are very enterprising, and they decided they needed a national forest. So over a period of time, they flew in about 25 pine trees, and the sign says you are now entering and leaving the Adak National Forest. Little sailor humor. It's cold. That's ice on the windshield wiper. We'd pick up ice all over the airplane. We had heated wings and tails, so it kept the flying surfaces okay, but everything that was sticking out of the airplane would get ice on it. The other thing that was cold was the Cold War. 1955, you know, I knew there was a Cold War on, but we got a mission to do and we're doing it. But one day the Russians, two Russian jets shot down one of our patrol planes. He made a successful crash landing on an island up in the Bering Strait. The crew all got out, a couple were very badly burned. But we would fly over international waters, keeping track of what the Russians were doing. They did not like it. This is the Cold War. We were vitally interested in what the Russians were doing with their nuclear weapons, the ballistic missiles, and so we kept tabs on them. They didn't like that, and periodically they'd come out in international waters and shoot down. This particular plane was one of about 20 that were shot down during the Cold War by the Russians. We did not shoot down any. This brought the Cold War particularly home to me because I had flown that airplane the day before on the same mission. We finished that deployment 6 months up in the Alaska area, came back to our home base in Alameda Bay Area, and being good Navy guys, a couple of us bought a sailboat. And we soon learned that girls like guys with sailboats. Worked out very nice. That's a Berkeley girl I'd met a couple of years before on a blind date. Back in our home base, we would stay there about a year for training. New people would come in, you'd form up new crews, you'd fly a lot of training missions, including going over to Hawaii. That's Diamond Head. And we had to navigate to get over there. We had to train our navigators because there was only one electronic navigation system at that time, very shaky. So we used the tried and true marine sextant, or the navigate by the stars. You measure the height, the angle of the star or the moon or the sun above the horizon. And then you do a bunch of calculations. That's the airborne version of the sextant. Been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. Go to the books, bunch of tables, plug it all in on a long piece of paper, stubby pencil, and after about 30 minutes of observation and calculation, you knew where you were 30 minutes ago. So you would make a correction to the course. Going 2,000 miles over water, you really want to make sure you're going the right direction. You'd correct, and then you'd start over and take another series of observations. Today, everybody here's got a smartphone with a GPS. Well, in your hand, you got more navigational capability than all of the systems I ever used in the Navy in 31 years, both flying or at sea. Back on another deployment, this time we whole squadron, 12 airplanes flew all the way to Japan, based in Iwakuni, Japan, because Russians had a submarine base in the Sea of Japan, and that's where we would go check on them. This was my first time overseas in a foreign country. I learned a great deal over the years how interesting it is to go to many, many different countries, see different cultures, different people. Sometimes we're alike, sometimes we're different, but it really is a fascinating education as you go throughout the world. Big day for me. I'm 25 years old. I've advanced well during my pilot training. I've now been assigned as a patrol plane commander, so I now have responsibility for this crew. That's me. That airplane. I'm responsible for their training, for their performance, and certainly responsible for their safety. A lot of responsibility comes early in the Navy, and this was at age 25. A little bit about the airplane. You can see it's got guns on the several places. Big radar down underneath, which looked out about 200 miles, help us pick up shipping contacts and other things. 2 reciprocating engines. They had 2 jet engines under the wing for extra help on takeoff, more power. And also, if you had an emergency, one of the other engines shut down, gave you some extra power to fly to get back to home base. This particular airplane, 620, I flew about 25 times, and it exists today. It's in the Pima County Air Museum in Tucson. Pilots over here, co-pilots over here, that's the cockpit, radios, throttles, and yes, we had to know what every one of those gauges meant. And in addition, if one of those gauges said something that wasn't very good, we had to know what to do about it. A lot of training, a lot of education went into being a pilot. This is back where the technical operators would be. That's a radar scope. These seats turn and face the scopes. Other electronics, look how crowded it is. Everything's jammed in, stuff's hanging down. You could not stand up in that airplane. The best you could do was like this, to move around in the airplane. And you remember wearing those big Mark IV exposure suits. Very, very uncomfortable. Just a scenic shot flying back across the Pacific. We'd fly a 12-plane squadron, 4 3-plane sections, and that's how we island hopped all the way back to our home base in Alameda. And we fast forward here a little bit. That's back up in Adak, Alaska. Same airplane, but it looks different. There's no guns. Plastic observer nose. Got electronic enclosure sticking out the back here. The Russian submarines had gotten harder to catch, harder to chase, and our technology kept up. We had much more modern equipment. They filled the inside of the airplane up with more modern equipment, but the weight of it, we had to take the guns off because the airplane wouldn't fly with too much weight. One summer in 1959, my crew and I did ice reconnaissance up over the Arctic Ocean. This is a windshield wiper. That's the Arctic ice in the summer. I'm sorry, the winter ice. We flew 30-some missions, 9 to 11-hour missions up over the ice. Looking at the ice, and also this is summer, you can see cracks and holes called polynyas. We dropped acoustic devices in there We didn't know what the big picture was. We knew what our part of the mission was. Turned out we did the first acoustic survey of the Arctic basin, and that was a prelude to our nuclear submarines going under the ice and surfacing at the North Pole. That happened about 4 months later. We found out, hey, we were part of that. We didn't know what we were part of. Our acoustic stuff, this is up on the ice. It's a floating ice island. There's about 25 scientists out there in little plywood huts. They were monitoring what's going on in the Arctic for weather-wise, and also they were the recipients of our acoustic devices. They got the information. A lot of research goes on. That still goes on today. Last summer, they had a similar group up on the ice, and nuclear submarines operated with them. For those of you that know a little bit about flying, this is a bad day. That engine has been secured. We were flying about 200 miles north of land. The engine had about 3 or 4 very violent explosions and started shaking itself apart. We feathered it, that's putting the blades so that the wind doesn't keep the engine turning, and let off the jet engine, headed back to land about 200 miles away. Problem was, there was 2 runways on the north slope of Alaska at that time. One was gravel on melting tundra, which was mud, so you couldn't land on it. The other one was a nice runway, about 5,000 feet long, but it was under reconstruction for the summer. It was now down to less than 2,000. I could not land on either one of them. So we had a choice to make. Did we have enough fuel to climb over this 10,000-foot range of mountains to get back to Fairbanks? We did our calculations with our stubby pencils and figured out, yes, we can do it. So we climbed using the jet engines, which sucked up fuel very, very fast. Did get over and landed at Fairbanks with almost empty tanks. So that was a nice day to get back on the ground. A scenic shot, but also this is high noon, 12 o'clock noon in November, about 200 miles north of Alaska over the Arctic. That's as high as the sun came up that day. That was our one external navigational reference using the Sextant. That's the only thing we had to navigate by. If you lived in Point Barrow, the northernmost city in our country, you would have 2 months, November to January, you would not see the sun. So it's very, very different flying up in very northern latitudes. I did come back from that deployment, and a very happy day. This lovely lady agreed to walk down the aisle with me. And Audrey's sitting there waving at me, and yes, that is the girl on the boat. It was just 6 years after we'd had the blind date. We honeymooned in Hawaii, came back to our base in Whidbey Island. A couple of weeks later, went down to Seattle, picked up this brand new Corvette that I'd ordered while in Alaska, and got back to our apartment. Neighbor comes banging on the door and says, "Hey, Bob, call the squadron." So I did, and what I heard was, "Lieutenant, you're taking your crew to Midway Island tomorrow." Oh. So my brand new bride got to break in this brand new Corvette. She thought I was going to war. She was and is a good driver, so everything turned out okay. There's Midway Island, Coral Atoll, Sandy Island, runways, hangars, a few living quarters. It's called Midway because it is midway between the North American continent and Asia. It's halfway, about 1,300 miles west of Hawaii. We were out there because the Russians were testing ballistic missiles. They had sent 3 ships out to monitor their tests, and our country needed to see what they were up to. So we had 3 crews. 2 crews flew every day. The 3rd crew was a backup, and we'd stay on the island. Well, what do you do when you're on an island, and what recreation do you have? There was a nightly movie. You read every magazine you could get your hands on, and you played cards, and that was it. There was no other recreation. So it was a nice beach, so we would lay on the beach, and we'd interact with the natives. That's a native. That's a Lasaian albatross. It's popularly called a goonie bird for a couple of reasons. One, their mating dance, they face each other and jump up and down. and for hours. So that something to do. You're laying on the beach just watching. The other thing was, being pilots, we were enormously critical of their flying ability. When they soared over the Pacific, which they would do, they fly all over the Pacific. Beautiful bird, about 8-foot wingspan. But when they're close to the ground, they're totally inept. They crash. Whether on running for takeoff or trying to land, they just tumble down the beach. So that entertained us. There was about 2,000 Goonies on the island at that time. There's no longer a military facility out there. There's a natural preserve. There are 200,000 Goonie birds on Midway Island today. I can't believe that. Technology moved along. Russian technology got better. Their submarines got better. Our equipment got better. This is a replacement airplane, much more electronics in it. Now it has 4-engine turboprop, much more comfortable. Cockpit looks pretty much the same, although the workload with 4 engines, now they've added a flight engineer that would sit between the 2 pilots. But the big change was back where the equipment operators were, the sensor operators. You can see everybody's got a nice seat. Everything, the panels are all nice, neat. There's no wires hanging down, and the most wonderful thing, you can stand up. You could walk from the front of the airplane to the back of the airplane just like you can in a commercial airplane. Wonderful, wonderful improvement, and the weapon system improvement also. At the 15-year point in my career, I advanced regularly and promoted to boot, and became a commanding officer of a squadron of 9 of these P-3 aircraft. So I now had 9 aircraft, 275 men working for me. I'm responsible for the maintenance of the airplane, the performance of the crews, their training, and of course their safety. Did that for about 1.5 years. Moved to another squadron. I'm moving up. I'm on the right there as a commanding officer of a squadron. Now I have 25 of those airplane and 1,200 people working for me. And nothing makes a commanding officer happier than having a flight crew set a safety milestone. Yes, we were a military outfit. Navy definitely is. So that's me as the commanding officer inspecting the troops. And I look back at this picture, everybody in there, they're squared away, they're sharp looking, their uniforms are very proper. That was a really great squadron, and this just reminds me of it. There was a great group of people. That's a wives club. My wife is down in front. She looks a little somber, but wives club were very important to us. We would deploy for 18 months at a time. No, sorry, 6 months at a time. Must seem like 18. For the families back home, how did they communicate with us? Only by letter. There was no emails, no texts, no phone. It was all by letter. So when they'd write a letter saying, hey, like, there's a problem at home, the car's not working or whatever, there was nothing we could do about it. So the wives club would form up, particularly the commanding officer's wife was kind of the catalyst, and somebody in that group, if somebody had a problem, somebody knew how to fix it. Fix the washing machine, or hey, I'll babysit while you take the other kid to the hospital, whatever. My wife did this commanding officer's wife routine 6 times. She got the job because she was my wife and the commanding officer's wife, and she did not get paid. She certainly should have. Just to update you a little bit, that's the P-3 aircraft that I flew. There are still some of those in the inventory flying, but the replacement, again, within the quantum improvement in electronics and sensors, is a P-8 Poseidon. It looks like a 737 airliner. That's the Russians we used to chase and still chase. Early on, diesel, easier to catch and follow. Put ballistic missiles on them, became much more of a threat. And today, this is what the Russians have. Ballistic missile submarines with a massive nuclear capability. The anti-submarine warfare forces today are doing exactly what I did 40 to 60 years ago. We're still trailing and watching after Russian submarines. Maritime air pilots, like I was, are good navigators. And a logical career progression was to become navigator of an aircraft carrier. So I navigated this carrier, Carrier Wasp, for about 18 months. operate the North Atlantic, Norwegian Sea, and Mediterranean. Navigator responsible for the safe navigation of the ship and the task group. Weather is not always cruise ship perfect. That's the bow of the aircraft carrier. That bow is 50 feet above the surface of the water. That's a storm in the Mediterranean off of Barcelona. A 900-foot long ship, getting a lot of water on it. That's a picture off the internet. That's the aircraft carrier Wasp, and it has what's known as a replenishment ship here. That ship in the middle is refueling the other two ships. That particular ship is the USS Hassayampa. That's called a fleet oiler. You can see my cap says USS Hassayampa on it. I was commanding officer of that ship during the Vietnam War. And it's a big ship. If you'd let me park it on your high school football field, you'd have to give me 2 football fields, plus spot me another 20 yards. It's that big. And what you don't see is it goes down in the water like a 3-story building. Carries 8 million gallons of fuel. And that's what the Navy did. They perfected the capability during World War II, continued it in Korea, Vietnam, still do it today. Replenishment ship here, aircraft carrier. There's 6, 7.5-inch diameter hoses going over there, jet fuel, ship fuel. And up on the trolley arrangement here, cargo going over, these are all bombs. This is Vietnam War, it's the Gulf of Tonkin. Oh, that's Vietnam War. That's how we kept the ships at sea. The supply ships go back, get filled up, bring it back out to the operating ships. Again, the weather can be a little heavy. That's the customer ship alongside. There's guys out on deck here, and there's a whole bunch back here manning the fueling rigs as they went along. That's my oiler, Hassayampa, diving into a wave, the aircraft carrier here, cruiser on the other side. My position would be right up here on the wing of the bridge out in the weather, and that's where I could observe the operations going on. And behind me, back behind this superstructure, there's probably 150 guys out there on deck in the weather, passing these fuel hoses back and forth. A lot of hard teamwork. And sometimes there was a great Navy day, we have to admit it. You can get up in the morning, come out and see something like that, and you say, man, this is really neat. Because it can be. I don't know how I got 2 of them in there, but anyway, still a nice day. There I am as the captain on the ship. We're going into port. Instead of a ball cap, I'm wearing what we call the bridge cap, a little more formal. Officer of the deck, he's directing the movement of the ship. He's got an assistant officer of the deck. One level below us, there's quartermasters and navigator, helmsman. There's all people all over the ship making things go. But as a captain, I don't have a thing to do as long as everything works. If it doesn't work, then the captain has to step in. If some ship gets in the way, an engineering problem, the engines quit, or somebody makes a mistake, the commanding officer is responsible. As a commanding officer, you have great authority, you have great prestige, but you have massive responsibility because everything that goes on is your responsibility. And you can't turn around and say, hey boss, what do I do now? You make the decision. Following that job, 18 months, I moved up to be commander of a service squadron. These are in the Atlantic Fleet. That's half of the replenishment ships in the Atlantic Fleet. Storage ships, oilers, fuel, ammunition ships. We kept the fleet at sea doing their job. A formal naval ceremony. I'm being relieved as commander of that service squadron, going between the side boys, very proper, bosun mate, Scotty Swissel, a very symbolic, the former leader is leaving, there's a new leader on board. Very, very symbolic ceremony. Happy family day. That's our son graduating from the Naval Academy, his mother and sister are pinning on his ensign shoulder boards. And 1 month later, there's our son starting on his 20-year Navy career, and I'm retiring on my 31-year career. My grandson put this up on Facebook a couple of years ago, and I just have to show it to you. That's a little bit of our family history of the military. My father, World War I veteran, 31 years for me, 30 years for our son. And our grandson is in his 4th year at the Coast Guard Academy as a cadet. Soon we'll be graduating next May. So that kind of summarizes my military activity, and the schools also want us to say, what have we done since we left the service? So here we go. I was a ship maintenance engineer in a private shipyard back in Virginia for a few years. Ironically, the shipyard was doing maintenance on Navy ships, some of the ships that I had commanded. So I'm now fixing them. And since then, I've been a volunteer. I've been on various city and county committees, homeowners associations, and of course, clear over here with the Freedom Committee. And you have to have a hobby. I still build things. So I build model trains. That's a room in our house that is full of trains. I build all that. And you travel. We've done a lot of traveling, some by ship, some by train. Been in the Caribbean. We're really good about going to the gym because keeping fit is very, very important to us. And travel, we've been a little bit in Northern Europe, but basically we've traveled in the United States. There are more great things to see in the United States, with the Western U.S., Canada. We've taken Amtrak all the way across country. Just a lot of things to do. So great to be here. And that pretty much summarizes my career. I'll put the final slide up here. Join the Navy and see the world. Yes, that really does work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to both our speakers. What incredible stories. Thank you for being here to share it with us. Now comes one of the favorite parts of our ceremony. At least this is what we're told by our veterans every year. You know, those who have stood ready to defend our freedom and our country have the appreciation of a grateful country and a grateful community. Some served in the armed forces and then returned home to contribute to our communities as teachers, nurses, salesmen, bankers, coaches, and a multitude of professions that are essential to our community life. And others continue to serve with the noble mission of an armed forces career. And we thank all of our veterans and would like to recognize those in our community who are here with us today. All of the veterans in active duty should have filled out a card on the way in. If you did not receive one, please raise your hand and one of our volunteers will get it to you. But I'd like to invite up Gold Award Girl Scouts Amanda Rourke and Julianne Wild to assist me in recognizing our veterans. And would also like to thank Brownie Troop 4497 and Junior Girl Scout Troop 3159 for the handmade thank you cards that they will be presenting to our veterans. And to the volunteers, are all the cards up here now? If you have any more, please bring them up.
All right, so first on the list is Mr. Dennis Mulvaney. His rank is Senior Airman First Class. His branch was 8th Air Force, and his date of service was 1953 to 1957.
Okay, so next we have Dave K. Hayward, First Lieutenant, U.S. Army Air Force, served February 1942 to October 1945.
Dave Tuma, rank is Airman First Class, branch is Air Force, and date of service is 1980 to 1986.
He's in the back of the room.
Scott Williams, First Lieutenant, U.S. Army, served 1966 to 1969.
Randy Scott, rank is Staff Sergeant, branch is U.S. Air Force, and date of service is 1963 to 1969.
Steve Morris, CPL, U.S. Army, served 1954 to 1956.
Merrill Clisby, rank is Staff Sergeant, branch is U.S. Air Force, and date of service is 1952 to 1956.
Eric Axel Jensen, Captain, U.S. Navy, served 1964 to 1987.
Kevin Orna, rank 02, branch Air Force, date of service February 6, 1915, and he is still currently serving.
Brian Reese, Airman, served 3 tours, Vietnam and Korea. Navy, served 1966 to 1970.
Tony Dellendorfer, rank Specialist 4, branch Army, date of service 1959 to 1965.
William Stanley, ETM, World War II. Navy, served 1942 to 1976.
Bill Liber, rank Sergeant, branch Army, date of service 1973 to 1976.
Neil Hull, SP4, Army, served 1964 to 1966.
Ben Yagodinsky, rank SP5, branch Army, date of service 1968 to 1969.
John Pointer, CSM, Army, served 1970 to 2000.
Michael Garnreiter, rank Private First Class, branch Marine Corps, date of service 1972.
Carl Schaefer, SFM3, U.S. Navy, served 1959 to 1965.
Frank McGrath, rank Lieutenant, branch U.S. Navy. He was in the Nuclear Submarine Force, date of service 1970 to 1976.
William L. Harris, Sergeant, Marine Corps, served 1965 to 1969.
Robert Olds, rank Captain, branch U.S. Navy, date of service July 1953 to July 1984. Gary Danielson, rank Petty Officer, branch U.S. Navy, date of service 1977 to 1983. Don Geyer, rank Seaman, branch Navy, date of service 1954. And lastly, John Ulrich, rank Staff Sergeant, branch U.S. Air Force, and date of service 1966 to 1970. Sorry, I got confused.
Hey, have we recognized everyone? Is there anyone that we may have missed? Because we want to be sure to give you your recognition. Okay, well, I see we have recognized everyone, so thank you all for your service to our country. Thank you very much. Thank you, guys. Hey, so I have something I'd like to say to our young people here today. You've heard some incredible history from the people who have lived it. This was a very rare opportunity. So take the lessons of what you learned today, what you heard. When you get home, write down some of the things that the gentleman talked about. And every Veterans Day, go back and review that, because that's the history of our country. And that's how we keep our destiny of freedom. So you've heard the living history. Keep it alive so that no one rewrites history in the future. Because to the youth here, you are our future leaders, and we're depending on you. So I would like to thank all those involved today to help make this program possible. I'd like to give a big thank you to Audrey Miller, who always arranges for our speakers. Thank you, Audrey. Thank you to Troop 772 and the scout leaders of Troop 772. Thank you to Donna Mulvaney for arranging for the Girl Scouts to be here today. Thank you to the Laguna Niguel Women's Club for volunteering. We appreciate your assistance. And the Laguna Niguel Military Support Committee, if you're a member of the committee, could you please stand up? And I'd like our community to recognize you. Our Military Support Committee has activities throughout the year to support our active duty military and their families. In fact, today quite a few of them are over at Walmart collecting toys for the holidays for our adopted units. But it takes all of us coming together to put on this program. So I appreciate everyone who was involved and those of you who continue carrying the message as far as our country and what our veterans have done. I invite you to share refreshments with us today, share some time, share some fellowship, talk to our veterans, let them know how much you appreciate them, also ask them some more about their stories. Before we break, though, I do ask all of you to remember in your prayers someone who works to keep our city safe every day. On Thursday, there was a vehicle accident with one of our motor deputies. So he has had serious but not life-threatening injuries. He is in the hospital, but we expect to see him back protecting the streets of Laguna Niguel in a couple of months. But please keep Motor Deputy Sean Duffy in your prayers for a swift and strong recovery. But thank you all for being here today. Enjoy some refreshments that the committee has there, and God bless America.